A man can survive every enemy outside his walls, but the greatest betrayal always sleeps beside him. Adrian Castellano stood alone in the silent bridal suite, the gold wedding band on his finger suddenly feeling heavier than the empire he had spent 15 years building. Beyond the towering windows, Manhattan shimmered beneath a midnight sky. The city celebrating a marriage the newspapers were already calling the wedding of the decade. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors. Thousands of white roses perfumed the room, and every detail whispered perfection. Yet perfection was exactly what frightened him. Victoria Sterling smiled as she removed her gloves with practiced elegance, her diamond bracelet catching the warm light. Anyone watching would have seen the flawless bride every magazine adored. Adrian watched something else. He watched hesitation. A pause so brief that no guest downstairs would have noticed it. A pause that froze every instinct he had learned to trust. His heart did not race. It simply became impossibly still. Earlier that evening, before they exchanged vows beneath a cathedral ceiling filled with candlelight, he had whispered one sentence only one woman in the world could answer. It was a tradition born years ago, during a rainstorm that neither money nor power could erase from his memory. She had smiled then, squeezed his hand, and promised she would always remember the answer. Now, on the first night of their marriage, he repeated the same quiet words. Victoria looked at him with polite confusion before forcing a small laugh. "You'll have to remind me," she said gently. "It's been such a long day." The room seemed to shrink around him. Adrian stared into her eyes, searching for recognition, for warmth, for even the smallest flicker of shared memory. There was nothing, only careful performance. He turned toward the window without another word. Far below, fireworks burst above the skyline, each brilliant explosion celebrating a future he suddenly no longer believed in. Behind him, Victoria continued speaking about tomorrow's reception, the honeymoon, interviews, charity events, everything a perfect bride should. Mention. Adrian heard every word, yet none of them reached him. Instead, another face quietly returned to his thoughts. Naomi Carter, the young black maid who had spent months preparing every corner of the estate for this wedding without ever asking for recognition. She was always the first person awake and the last person to leave. Invisible to most guests. Invisible even to him, or so he had believed. Yet unlike everyone else in the mansion, she never forgot details. She remembered birthdays, favorite coffee blends, old family traditions, even the names of staff members no executive bothered to learn. She had looked at him that morning with eyes carrying a sadness he could not explain, as if she wanted to say something that words refused to carry. Then Victoria had interrupted, smiling brightly, pulling his attention away before Naomi could speak. At the time, he dismissed it as wedding nerves. Now that forgotten moment echoed louder than the fireworks outside. Adrian slowly removed his jacket and laid it across the chair. His reflection stared back from the dark glass, not as the city's most respected businessman or the feared leader whose name silenced boardrooms and rival families alike, but as a man confronting the possibility that the vows he had spoken only hours earlier rested upon a terrible lie. Somewhere inside the mansion, staff members were finishing their work, clearing champagne glasses, folding linen, extinguishing candles, believing the happiest chapter of his life had just begun. None of them knew that one forgotten sentence had already cracked the foundation of his marriage. And before the sun rose over New York, Adrian Castellano would begin searching for a truth that threatened to unravel everything he believed about the woman he had just called his wife. 3 weeks earlier, the Castellano estate had awakened before sunrise every morning, not because anyone demanded it, but because one quiet woman believed every celebration reflected the character of the people behind it. Naomi Carter crossed the marble foyer carrying fresh white lilies, her dark curls tied neatly beneath a simple scarf as the first rays of morning spilled across the polished floors. She moved with calm purpose, replacing flowers, checking guest lists, inspecting table settings, and making certain every member of the household had what they needed before they even realized they needed it. Most people never noticed her. That was the strange gift of people like Naomi. They made impossible things look effortless until everyone assumed they had simply happened on their own. Adrian Castellano rarely entered the ballroom while preparations were underway, but on one quiet afternoon, he paused outside the enormous doors, watching workers transform the space into something worthy of history. Elegant crystal chandeliers reflected soft golden light across endless rows of perfectly arranged tables. Every ribbon, every candle, every polished glass had been placed exactly where it belonged. Event planners proudly accepted compliments from visiting executives, yet Naomi remained in the background, quietly adjusting a chair that was less than an inch out of alignment. She smiled warmly at an elderly florist struggling with heavy boxes and carried them herself without waiting to be asked. When one of the younger kitchen assistants accidentally dropped an expensive serving tray and burst into embarrassed tears, Naomi simply knelt beside her, helped gather the broken pieces safely, and whispered something that made the young woman laugh through her anxiety. Kindness seemed to follow her as naturally as breathing. Adrian noticed these moments without realizing he was collecting them. They were tiny details buried beneath board meetings, security briefings, and wedding interviews, but somehow they stayed with him. Victoria Sterling, meanwhile, understood exactly where every camera stood. She greeted reporters with flawless confidence, charmed investors with polished conversations, and accepted admiration as though she had always belonged in the Castellano world. Every appearance was carefully rehearsed, every smile perfectly measured. Society adored her elegance, and the headlines praised her as the future queen beside New York's most influential businessman. Few people questioned anything because perfection is often easier to believe than quiet. Sincerity. Whenever guests complimented the decorations or the smooth organization of the upcoming ceremony, Victoria graciously accepted the praise with effortless confidence. Naomi simply continued working. She never corrected anyone. She never reminded them who had spent endless hours making every detail possible. One afternoon, while reviewing seating charts in the library, Adrian overheard Victoria laughing softly with several socialites. "I honestly do not know how people spend their lives cleaning after others," one woman remarked. Victoria smiled politely before replying. "Some people are simply meant to serve. Everyone has their place." The women laughed together before continuing their conversation about designer gowns and honeymoon destinations. Adrian barely reacted at the time. The comments sounded harmless amid the endless noise surrounding the wedding. Yet across the hallway, Naomi had heard every word while carrying freshly pressed table linens. She paused for only a heartbeat before continuing down the corridor with the same quiet dignity she always carried. She did not defend herself. She did not show anger. She simply kept walking, as though preserving her own peace mattered more than winning an argument no one else would remember. Adrian watched her disappear around the corner, strangely unsettled by the expression on her face. It was not sadness. It was not humiliation. It was something far more difficult to understand. It was the calm acceptance of someone who had grown accustomed to being overlooked, even while quietly holding together the very world that refused to see her. The following week, invitations traveled across the country, private aircraft arrived at the Castellano estate, and every conversation seemed to revolve around the wedding that promised to unite two of New York's most influential families. Reporters gathered outside the gates from sunrise until long after sunset, hoping to capture a single photograph of Adrian and Victoria before the ceremony. Inside the mansion, however, another story unfolded beyond the reach of cameras. Naomi Carter carried stacks of handwritten seating cards through the grand hallway, quietly. Comparing every guest name against the final attendance list, she noticed that one table assignment had been changed without approval. It placed Adrian's elderly aunt, who struggled with her eyesight, far from the stage where she had hoped to watch the ceremony. Naomi corrected the mistake without telling anyone who had created it. To her, protecting another person's happiness mattered more than receiving credit. Later that afternoon, she entered the music room carrying fresh flowers and unexpectedly found Adrian standing alone beside the piano his late mother used to play. He looked tired despite the constant congratulations surrounding him. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Naomi carefully placed the flowers beside an old framed photograph before quietly saying, "Your mother always chose white lilies because she believed they reminded people to stay honest when life became complicated." Adrian slowly looked toward the arrangement. "How did you know that?" he asked. Naomi hesitated, almost as if she regretted speaking. "Mrs. Evelyn told me during my first week here. She said traditions only survive when someone remembers them." Adrian nodded thoughtfully, surprised that a conversation lasting only seconds somehow felt more sincere than dozens of interviews he had given that month. Before he could ask another question, Victoria entered the room with effortless confidence. "There you are," she said warmly as she slipped her hand through Adrian's arm. Her smile remained flawless as she glanced toward Naomi. "Would you mind bringing coffee to the terrace? We have photographers waiting." Naomi answered with the same respectful smile she offered everyone. "Of course, Miss Sterling." As she walked toward the kitchen, Victoria watched until she disappeared around the corner before lowering her voice. "She is a good employee, but sometimes she forgets boundaries. Staff should remain invisible during family moments." Adrian looked toward the doorway where Naomi had just left. Something about the comment felt unnecessarily cold, yet he dismissed the feeling almost immediately. There were schedules to approve, guests to greet, and responsibilities that demanded his attention. Meanwhile, Naomi prepared the coffee service exactly as requested. While arranging porcelain cups on a silver tray, she overheard two wedding planners discussing a missing envelope that contained the original guest registry. One planner blamed a young assistant who looked terrified. Naomi quietly searched the office herself and discovered the envelope inside a folder that had been moved during a meeting. She returned it before anyone noticed the mistake. The assistant thanked her with tears in her eyes. Naomi simply smiled and replied, "Everyone deserves the chance to have one difficult day instead of one ruined career." Hours later, Adrian accidentally learned that the crisis had been solved, but no one mentioned Naomi's name. Once again, someone else accepted the praise while she returned to polishing crystal glasses beneath the warm evening lights. She carried herself with the same quiet grace as always, never asking to be seen, never expecting applause, unaware that the smallest acts of integrity often leave the deepest impression on hearts that are not yet ready to recognize their true value. The wedding morning arrived wrapped in golden sunlight that poured through the towering windows of St. Michael Cathedral, painting the polished stone with warm reflections that made the entire sanctuary feel almost timeless. Hundreds of white roses lined the aisle exactly as planned. Every candle burned at the same height. Every ribbon rested without a wrinkle, and every guest whispered that they had never seen a ceremony so flawless. Naomi Carter had been awake since 4 o'clock that morning, making certain every final detail honored the standards the Castellano family expected. She checked the floral arrangements one last time, quietly adjusted a flower girl's crooked sash, comforted a nervous violinist whose hands would not stop shaking, and even repaired a loose button on one of the usher's jackets moments before the guests entered. She moved from one responsibility to another with gentle confidence, leaving behind nothing except calm wherever she went. Yet no one noticed the woman making perfection possible. They only admired the perfection itself. Victoria Sterling stepped from her bridal suite, surrounded by photographers and excited bridesmaids, every camera immediately turning toward her dazzling smile. Compliments followed her through every hallway. Guests praised her elegance, her grace, and her future beside Adrian Castellano, while Naomi quietly disappeared behind serving carts carrying emergency supplies that she hoped no one would ever need. During the reception, the ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers as an orchestra filled the air with soft music. Influential politicians, business leaders, and respected families raised champagne glasses to celebrate the newlyweds. Adrian greeted each guest with composed confidence, unaware that his eyes occasionally searched the room for reasons he could not explain. More than once he noticed Naomi solving problems before anyone realized they existed. She directed kitchen staff around unexpected delays, found a misplaced wedding gift belonging to Adrian's elderly aunt, and gently guided confused guests toward the correct seating without interrupting a single conversation. She seemed to exist everywhere at once while asking for nothing in return. Then came a moment almost too small for anyone to remember, except the people standing close enough to hear it. One of Victoria's fashionable friends glanced toward Naomi as she carried another tray across the ballroom and laughed softly. "She certainly takes this job seriously," the woman remarked. Victoria smiled without looking away from the guests surrounding her. "That is because serving people like us is probably the most important achievement she will ever have." Several guests laughed politely before returning to their conversations. Naomi heard every word as she passed only a few feet away. She slowed for the briefest second before continuing forward with the same peaceful expression she had worn all day. She did not defend herself. She did not react. She simply continued serving drinks to elderly guests with the same kindness she offered everyone else. Adrian caught the exchange from across the ballroom. The laughter reached him, although the music nearly buried the words themselves. Something inside him tightened. It was not anger exactly, but quiet discomfort that refused to disappear. He watched Naomi thank an older gentleman for attending before helping him find a comfortable seat near the dance floor. She smiled with genuine warmth, as though the careless remarks had never happened. For reasons Adrian could not explain, that silent dignity stayed with him longer than every toast, every photograph, and every standing ovation the evening offered. While the celebration continued beneath sparkling lights and endless applause, an invisible line had already begun to separate appearance from truth, and no one inside the magnificent ballroom realized that the happiest day of their lives had quietly become the first step toward a revelation that would change every relationship inside the Castellano estate. When the last guests finally departed and the orchestra packed away its instruments, silence settled over the Castellano estate for the first time in weeks. The celebration that had filled every hallway with laughter faded into the quiet rhythm of staff clearing crystal glasses and extinguishing candles one by one. Adrian Castellano walked through the mansion without speaking, still dressed in his formal black tuxedo, his thoughts strangely distant despite the successful ceremony everyone would remember for years. Every newspaper would print photographs of smiling faces the following morning. Every headline would praise a perfect union. Yet an uncomfortable feeling had quietly followed him since the reception, refusing to disappear no matter how many congratulations he accepted. As he entered the bridal suite, Victoria smiled warmly and admired the breathtaking skyline beyond the windows. She spoke excitedly about the honeymoon itinerary, charitable foundations they would visit together, and the interviews already scheduled for the coming week. Adrian listened politely while loosening his tie, but another memory continued pressing against the back of his mind. Years earlier, before wealth and public attention complicated every relationship in his life, he had shared a simple private tradition with the woman he trusted most. Whenever either of them felt uncertain, one would quietly ask, "Where does the light always return?" The other would answer without hesitation, "Home is never a place. Home is the person who remembers you." It was never written down. It never appeared in messages. It belonged only to two people. Adrian turned toward Victoria with a gentle smile that concealed growing curiosity. "Where does the light always return?" he asked softly. Victoria looked at him with pleasant confusion before laughing as though he had told an inside joke she simply could not recall. "You always come up with mysterious questions," she replied. "Tell me the answer so I can remember it next time." The words landed with terrifying quiet. Adrian did not respond immediately. Instead, he walked toward the window where New York glowed beneath thousands of lights stretching endlessly into the distance. His reflection stared back at him through the glass, calm on the outside while every instinct inside warned him that something impossible had just happened. The woman standing behind him should have answered without thinking. She should have smiled before he even finished asking. She should have remembered the sentence that had carried them through difficult years. But she did not. Behind him, Victoria continued speaking cheerfully, unaware that a single forgotten answer had shaken the foundation beneath their marriage. Adrian slowly closed his eyes, searching for another explanation. Perhaps exhaustion had clouded her memory. The wedding had been overwhelming. Countless conversations, endless photographs, constant attention. Anyone could forget something after such a long day. Yet even as he tried to convince himself, another image quietly surfaced. Naomi Carter standing in the music room beside his mother's piano, remembering a family tradition no outsider should have known. Naomi gently correcting forgotten details no one else noticed. Naomi carrying herself with quiet certainty every time history, customs, or memories became important. The contrast unsettled him far more than he wanted to admit. He looked once more toward Victoria, who had already begun organizing gifts left inside the suite with flawless composure. Everything about her appeared exactly as it should. Everything looked perfect, and somehow, perfection had never felt more unfamiliar. Before the first light of dawn touched the skyline, Adrian made a silent decision. He would ask no accusations, reveal no suspicion, and offer no confrontation. Instead, he would begin looking backward through every conversation, every memory, and every unnoticed moment leading to this night. Because somewhere hidden beneath flawless appearances rested a truth patient enough to wait until someone finally chose to see it. The next morning arrived with clear skies and glowing headlines celebrating a wedding that appeared flawless from every angle. Television anchors praised the elegance of the ceremony. Financial reporters spoke about the powerful alliance between two respected families, and social media overflowed with photographs of smiling faces beneath crystal chandeliers. Adrian Castellano watched none of it. Instead, he sat alone inside his private study with a cup of untouched coffee growing cold beside him. For the first time in years, he postponed meetings that normally demanded his full attention. Something far more important required answers. He began with the smallest details because experience had taught him that the truth rarely announced itself with dramatic gestures. It revealed itself through ordinary moments that everyone else ignored. He requested the complete wedding planning schedule, not because he questioned the ceremony itself, but because he wanted to understand who had truly organized every decision. The documents surprised him. Although Victoria's name appeared throughout the official presentations, handwritten notes in the margins repeatedly carried another signature. Naomi Carter. Every adjustment, every emergency solution, every last-minute correction had been documented in careful handwriting that no one had bothered to acknowledge. Adrian quietly continued reading. Later that afternoon, he walked through the mansion as though simply inspecting the estate after the celebration. Staff members greeted him respectfully before returning to their duties. He stopped beside the head housekeeper and casually asked, "Who kept everything together these past few weeks?" The woman answered without hesitation, "Mr. Castellano, if you are asking who made the wedding possible, it was Miss Naomi. She arrived before everyone else and stayed after everyone left. She solved problems before we even knew they existed." Adrian nodded thoughtfully, but asked no further questions. A few minutes later, he found the security supervisor reviewing recordings from the previous evening. Adrian requested access to several routine camera angles covering service hallways, storage rooms, and preparation areas. He was not searching for scandal. He simply wanted to observe what happened when no guests were watching. Hour after hour, the recordings revealed the same quiet pattern. Naomi helping exhausted employees without complaint. Naomi returning misplaced family heirlooms before anyone noticed they were missing. Naomi calming nervous musicians moments before the ceremony began. Again and again, Victoria appeared only when photographers or distinguished guests entered the room, accepting compliments with graceful confidence while never acknowledging the countless invisible hands that had created the success everyone admired. None of the recordings proved dishonesty, yet together they painted a picture Adrian had never taken the time to see. As evening approached, he wandered into the music room where sunlight stretched across the polished piano once belonging to his mother. Fresh white lilies rested in the same vase Naomi had arranged days earlier. They remained perfectly cared for despite the busy schedule surrounding the wedding. Adrian gently touched one of the petals before remembering Naomi's quiet words about family traditions surviving only because someone chose to remember them. Suddenly, another memory surfaced with startling clarity. Years ago, after his mother passed away, someone had continued placing fresh white lilies beside the piano every Monday morning without fail. He had always assumed the florist handled it automatically. Now he realized he had never actually asked who remembered that promise. Standing alone in the peaceful room, Adrian understood that his search was no longer about one forgotten sentence on his wedding night. It had become something much deeper. Every overlooked act of kindness, every silent sacrifice, and every forgotten tradition seemed to point toward one woman whose quiet presence had shaped his life far more than he had ever allowed himself to recognize. Adrian did not speak about his discoveries to anyone. Instead, he continued observing the people around him with a patience that had once protected his business from costly mistakes. This time, however, the investment was not measured in dollars but in trust. 2 days after the wedding, he announced a small appreciation luncheon for the household staff, explaining that everyone who had contributed to the ceremony deserved recognition. The invitation surprised the employees. Most assumed they would simply receive a polite thank you before returning to their routines. Naomi Carter quietly arranged the dining room exactly as she had arranged every other event, making certain everyone else felt welcomed before taking the last available seat near the end of the table. Victoria arrived moments later wearing an elegant cream-colored dress, smiling confidently, as though nothing in the world had changed. Adrian stood near the fireplace, greeting each employee by name, something he had rarely done in the past. As lunch progressed, he asked simple questions that seemed almost casual. He thanked the kitchen team for their long hours, complimented the gardeners for maintaining the estate, and praised the musicians who had performed during the ceremony. Then he turned toward the head florist. "The white lilies beside my mother's piano were beautiful," he said. "Who remembered to place them there every Monday all these years?" The elderly florist smiled warmly before answering without hesitation. "Miss Naomi has always reminded us. After your mother passed away, she asked us never to let the tradition end because she believed it brought peace to the house." The room became unexpectedly quiet. Adrian slowly looked toward Naomi, who lowered her eyes as though the attention made her uncomfortable. "Why did you never tell me?" he asked gently. Naomi offered a modest smile. "It was never my story to tell, Mr. Castellano. Your mother wanted the house to feel like home, even after she was gone. I only tried to honor her wish." Before Adrian could respond, another longtime employee spoke up. "She did much more than that, sir. During the winter storm 3 years ago, when the roads were closed and deliveries could not reach the estate, Miss Naomi stayed here for 3 straight days so your elderly aunt would never miss her medication. She never asked anyone to mention it." A second employee nodded. "And when your scholarship foundation lost contact with one of the student families, she spent her own day off locating them because she said promises should never be forgotten." One story quietly led to another. Every employee around the table seemed to remember an act of kindness Naomi had performed without expecting recognition. She had organized holiday gifts for children whose parents worked at the estate. She had visited retired staff members after they left the household. She remembered birthdays, anniversaries, favorite meals, and family traditions with remarkable care. Adrian listened in complete silence. None of these stories had reached his desk because Naomi had never allowed them to become accomplishments for public admiration. Across the table, Victoria's smile slowly became more restrained. Whenever someone praised Naomi, she politely redirected the conversation toward the success of the wedding or the generosity of the Castellano family, but the room no longer followed her lead. For the first time since Adrian had met her, attention settled naturally upon someone who had never sought it. As the luncheon ended, Naomi quietly gathered empty plates before anyone could stop her, thanking the staff for sharing a meal together as though she had received the greatest gift of all. Adrian watched her leave the room carrying nothing except the same quiet dignity she had always possessed, and in that ordinary moment he realized that the people who truly shape a family often stand farthest from the spotlight, waiting for someone with honest eyes to finally recognize the truth that had been present all along. 3 evenings later, Adrian invited a small circle of family members, trusted advisors, and the senior household staff to the grand reception hall under the simple explanation that he wished to express his gratitude after the wedding. No reporters were invited. No photographers stood waiting outside. For the first time in weeks, the magnificent room that had witnessed endless celebration felt calm enough for honesty to breathe. Crystal chandeliers cast a gentle glow across polished marble floors, while the same white lilies Naomi had carefully arranged filled the air with their familiar fragrance. Victoria entered with quiet confidence, believing the gathering would become another opportunity to celebrate the family's future. Naomi arrived a few minutes later in her usual staff uniform, intending only to serve refreshments before returning to her duties. She quietly placed coffee cups on the table until Adrian spoke. "Miss Carter," he said with unexpected warmth, "please take a seat." The request surprised everyone in the room. Naomi hesitated before carefully sitting at the far end of the long table, clearly uncomfortable, becoming the center of attention. Adrian remained standing. He looked around the room before speaking with calm certainty. "During the past several days, I have learned something important. Success does not belong to the people who receive the loudest applause. It belongs to those who quietly carry responsibility when nobody is watching." The room fell completely silent. Adrian slowly lifted a folder containing handwritten notes, planning schedules, and letters he had gathered during his search. Every page I reviewed pointed to the same person. Every member of this household told the same story. Every tradition my family believed had survived on its own was preserved by someone who never asked for recognition. He turned toward Naomi. That person was you. Naomi immediately shook her head. Mr. Castellano, I only did my job. Adrian answered gently, no. You protected my family's history. There is a difference. Several employees lowered their eyes, remembering how often Naomi had quietly accepted credit being given to others. Adrian continued. I also realized that kindness is easiest to ignore because it never demands attention. I allowed that mistake to become part of my own character, and for that I owe someone an apology. He walked toward Naomi, stopping only a few feet away. Every person in the room watched without speaking. Miss Carter, I overlooked your dedication, your integrity, and your humanity. I accepted appearances instead of paying attention to actions. I am sincerely sorry. Naomi looked genuinely surprised. After a long moment, she offered the same gentle smile that had comforted so many others inside the estate. You do not owe me anything, sir. Everyone misses things when life becomes busy. Adrian quietly replied, perhaps, but that does not excuse failing to recognize goodness standing directly in front of me. Across the room, Victoria's expression slowly changed. The effortless confidence she had carried throughout the engagement gave way to visible discomfort as more employees nodded in quiet agreement. Nobody argued with Adrian because every story he had shared reflected moments they had personally witnessed. No accusations were spoken against Victoria. No dramatic confrontation unfolded. Instead, something far more powerful filled the room. Truth quietly replaced appearance. Respect naturally shifted toward the woman who had earned it through years of faithful service rather than polished speeches. As the silence lingered beneath the warm lights, even those who had once overlooked Naomi understood they had mistaken humility for insignificance, and that realization carried more weight than any public judgment ever could. The days that followed changed the atmosphere inside the Castellano estate in ways no renovation or celebration ever could. Conversations became quieter, greetings became warmer, and people who had once hurried past one another now paused long enough to say thank you. Respect had slowly replaced assumption. Adrian Castellano noticed the difference every morning as he walked through the halls his family had occupied for generations. The mansion itself had not changed, yet it somehow felt more like a home than it had in years. One crisp autumn morning, sunlight spilled across the music room, where fresh white lilies rested beside his mother's piano exactly as they always had. Adrian entered expecting to find Naomi arranging the flowers, but the room was empty except for a handwritten note placed carefully beneath the vase. He unfolded the simple piece of paper and immediately recognized Naomi's neat handwriting. She thanked the Castellano family for allowing her to serve their household and explained that she had accepted a position leading hospitality training for a charitable organization that helped young people build meaningful careers. She wrote that every lesson she had learned inside the estate deserved to be shared with others who only needed someone willing to believe in them. There was no resentment in her words, no complaint, no reminder of past misunderstandings. She ended with a single sentence that lingered in Adrian's mind long after he folded the note. The greatest gift anyone can receive is to leave a place kinder than they found it. Adrian quietly looked around the room before placing the note beside the lilies. He realized that throughout all his searching, he had believed he was trying to solve a mystery. In truth, he had been learning to recognize character. Wealth had taught him how to evaluate opportunities. Success had taught him how to negotiate difficult decisions. But Naomi had unknowingly taught him something far more valuable. The strongest people rarely announce their strength. They reveal it through consistency, humility, and compassion repeated day after day until those quiet choices become impossible to ignore. Several weeks later, Adrian established a new annual recognition program honoring every employee whose unseen service strengthened the lives of others inside the organization. The award carried no famous family name. Instead, it celebrated integrity itself. Many recipients never expected to be noticed, and that was exactly the point. Victoria also changed after the gathering in the reception hall. Without public arguments or dramatic confrontations, she gradually withdrew from the life she had once tried so carefully to control. She came to understand that admiration earned through appearance could disappear overnight, while respect earned through character only grew stronger with time. On a cool afternoon near the end of the season, Adrian visited the charitable organization where Naomi now worked. Through a glass window, he watched her encouraging a room filled with young trainees preparing for their first jobs. She spoke to each person with the same patience and kindness she had always shown inside the Castellano estate. She never noticed Adrian standing quietly in the hallway because her attention remained focused on helping someone else believe in themselves. He smiled softly before turning away without interrupting the class. Some people entered a life for recognition. Others entered it to leave behind something far more lasting. As Adrian stepped into the afternoon sunlight, he finally understood that dignity could never be purchased, borrowed, or inherited. It could only be lived. And on that quiet day, everyone whose life had crossed Naomi Carter's path remembered what true dignity looked like.